So as oil markets digest the news of Maduro's capture, the rest of the world is waiting to see how the U.S. move to depose Venezuelan strongman could reshape power dynamics across Latin America, and even more pressing, whether this move will draw in global powers like China and Russia, which are key Venezuelan allies. Joining me now to break all of this down, Eurasia Group founder Ian Bremmer. Ian, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time and your expertise. Sure. Maybe just we'll start with your big picture thoughts on sort of what this does mean geopolitically.
Well, the fact that President Trump has embraced publicly the Donroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere will be prioritized for American influence and strategic control. It's not the limit of American ambitions, but it certainly is priority number one, means that Trump will now try to populate that with more wins. So this is not just about Venezuela, though there's a lot to do in Venezuela if you're President Trump right now. It's also about other countries in the region where he really doesn't like the government, thinks that they operate against U.S. interests, Nicaragua, Cuba in particular. It's about countries where there are drug cartels in operation that he feels like he might be able to take unilateral action against them, despite the fact that it's on territory of allies. Here I'm thinking about Colombia and Mexico. And of course, very dramatically, it's about Trump continuing to talk about the fact that the Americans need Greenland, which is, of course, part of Danish territory, a steadfast but very small and not very powerful ally of the United States. And the Nordic countries are in absolute crisis mode as a consequence of that.
I want to talk about Greenland, but first I want to stick with Venezuela before we move on. I read a note this morning that said the political theater for laymen, people like me, is oil or drug trafficking. But the real issue is critical minerals and keeping China and Russia and Iran out of our backyard. You mentioned the Donroe Doctrine and the Western Hemisphere. China controls about basically almost all of the critical minerals. And guess what? Venezuela has a lot of them. But China, via Venezuela, is also putting a chokehold on rare earth and critical minerals that we need for our defense sector. Is that sort of an underreported version of this that you also see as an issue?
Yes, globally, but not in terms of Venezuela. The conversations that have been happening between Trump, Stephen Miller, John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, over the last several months as they've been planning this, have not been about critical minerals in Venezuela. They've been about Maduro, and specifically the view that anything would be better than Maduro. So given that Trump has sent all of this military equipment and gave those ultimatums, and that Maduro was taunting him, said basically, come at me. I don't believe that you're going to do anything, doing the Trump dance on television, all of that. We should not underestimate that a big part of the goal is removing Maduro, and specifically removing him without American fatalities and bringing him to justice in the United States. In fact, to New York City, the world's largest constellation of media market, so that everyone can focus on the trial. So don't underestimate how important it is for Trump to have gotten Maduro out. In his view, that's the priority.
Then why keep the VP there and say that it's not regime change? Because a lot of people don't like that word. We remember Iraq. We remember a lot of this regime change that frankly does not go well when America goes and tries to install a new government. What is the risk of that VP and the same regime as Maduro staying in power?
But Trump doesn't really care that much who it is that's running Venezuela, as long as that leader or group of leaders are doing what the Americans want, in kicking out the Russians and Hezbollah and Iran, in providing favorable investment climate for the Americans to come in and take the oil, investing in critical minerals, shutting down the drugs, dealing with American migrants from Venezuela, sending them back, all of those things. He's not particularly interested in democratic elections. Marco Rubio cares about that. A lot of Venezuelan emigres in Florida and other parts of the U.S. care about it, but Trump does not. And that's why he's not really talking about it in response to these attacks. This is not regime change. I would call it regime roulette. You got rid of Maduro, you spin the wheel, and now you've got the vice president who was fully part of the regime and doesn't have a ransom, a bounty on her head. I mean, wasn't, being sought for extradition by the United States, but has been no friend of the U.S. and certainly doesn't seem like she was in on the operation. I think she was surprised by the operation when it occurred.
So big picture, does this justify Russia in Ukraine? And a lot of people are waking up this morning and then wondering what we tell China if or when they try to do the same thing to Taiwan. What do you say?
Well, the Russians, of course, denounced this as an illegal intervention, and they are experts on illegal interventions. So they really do know what they're talking about there. But of course, when we talk about Russia, we're talking about invading a country that was democratically elected, sending in their troops and trying to overturn that regime and install a friendly regime to themselves. Here, the United States has removed not only a narco-terrorist, but someone that stole a democratic election that the Venezuelan people voted for. The interesting thing here, of course, is that the United States has said that Maria Machado, who is the opposition that is legitimate, does not have the power to run the country, and they're not trying to install it.
I want to broaden this out a little bit as well and talk about just overall, you've mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. It was top of the risks in 2026. Why is that so high, and does it remain there?
Well, it's so high because the United States is the most powerful country in the world. And unlike on the global economic map, where there are a number of countries that have influence and can stop the Americans when the United States wants to do things. So the U.S.-China relationship, U.S. puts tariffs on, U.S. hits the Chinese hit the Americans back hard, Trump has to back down. But militarily, the United States enjoys a unipolar advantage, especially in its backyard, but not only in its backyard, in the Middle East as well, for Europe and the rest. And so the fact that the United States is now leaning into its asymmetric power capability in favor of its own interests and doing so unilaterally, really with very little interest in coordinating with its allies, in discussing with its allies what their security concerns are. This is an expansion of America First to foreign policy. And given that the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world, especially militarily, that has enormous implications for how we think about the global order.
You could see that it started with the Panama Canal and telling China to back off and get out of our backyard. Also, just broadly speaking, want to think about what else should be on our geopolitical risks as we think about 2026. You're out with your latest note. What else do you see is pretty high up there in terms of a risk this year?
Three big things. One is that the Europeans are in a lot of trouble here. They're getting squeezed by the Russians, squeezed by the Americans that don't want a strong European Union. Their own leading governments are very weak and their centers are falling apart. France, Germany, and outside the EU, UK. It's going to be a very tough time for the Europeans to respond in a way that would make the Americans think they need to treat them as partners and allies as opposed to as supplicants that you can act as a predator with. The Chinese, as the Americans are the world's leading petrostate with 13.5 million barrels of oil every day, and now taking over the oil in Venezuela, the Chinese are investing in electrons. They're becoming an electrostate. It's all about solar and batteries and critical earths and nuclear and wind. And that's the 21st century energy that's getting a lot cheaper. And so long term, if the Americans are only going to do oil, gas, and coal, but cede all of the post-carbon energies to Chinese leadership, that's a great vulnerability for the United States. And finally, the political environment in the U.S. Because, of course, many in the United States, including the president, believe that the principal enemy of the U.S. is in the U.S. Democrats say that about Trump. Trump says that about the Democratic opposition, not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the North Koreans, not the Iranians. And to the extent that Trump, the most powerful president who has consolidated all this power with a loyal group around him and trying to control the administrative state in the U.S. and doing all of that because he thinks the Democrats weaponized it against him, that fight inside the U.S. could play out much more consequentially for the U.S. and others than the fights that we're seeing in Venezuela or Ukraine or last year in Gaza.
Ian Bremmer, love the chat. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and we'll be watching those key risks that you just outlined.